I was sitting at the table, surrounded by coworkers. The company dinner went on like any other corporate event, exaggerated toasts, forced laughter, smiles that hid hypocrisy. But at that moment, my attention was taken away by a scene that made me feel a biting cold run down my spine. Across the room, I saw a strange man approach my wife. He held something small, shiny, and as she smiled, he slipped a gold band into her hand. I lacked air. The noise around me became a muffled hum. I felt the blood pulsing hard in my temples as I stood up from the chair, the long, steady steps taking me towards them without my mind having time to process. What does this mean? Why this alliance? Who is this guy? Explain everything to me now. My voice sounded louder than I expected, more filled with fury and disbelief than I ever imagined I could express. The entire hall fell silent. The eyes turned to us. My wife's eyes widened, her hand shook on the table. The man, this bastard, remained silent, but there was a sparkle in his eyes, a mix of triumph and contempt that made me want to rip that smile off his face. She opened her mouth, hesitated. The seconds of silence were more lethal than any response. My chest was rising and falling uncontrollably, my breathing was short, my stomach was churning with the worst of certainty. Let's get a divorce immediately, I spat the words, as if throwing them to the wind was enough to end the humiliation. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. She tried to touch my hand, but I backed away. Her skin burned like embers in my memory, the same hands that had so often held mine, now trembling, soiled by something I still didn't fully understand. My world collapsed there, at that table, in front of everyone. The corporate dinner that was supposed to be just another boring event became the exact moment my life fell apart. I needed to know. I needed to understand. How does a man just show up in the middle of a dinner party and hand a married woman a ring? How did she allow this? How long had this been going on? I didn't want to scream anymore, I didn't want to turn it into a bigger spectacle than it already was. So, I took a deep breath, swallowed the pain, and in the most controlled voice I could muster, I asked again, why this alliance? Who are you? The man finally spoke up. And what he said made everything worse. I'm someone she knows better than you know. My vision went dark. The ground seemed to have disappeared beneath my feet. My body tensed, my fists clenched. I wanted to punch him right then and there, but my mind was screaming for answers. I turned to her. Are you going to say something or are you going to keep stabbing me with this silence? She swallowed hard. His hands tightened around the ring, as if it were a shield, something that was supposed to protect, something that didn't belong to me. Then she murmured something I almost couldn't hear. It's not what it seems, my laugh was bitter. Isn't that what it looks like? I repeated, feeling the venom in my own voice. Then tell me what it is. Tell me I'm not watching my wife receive a ring from a stranger in the middle of a company event. Tell me I'm not the idiot who was blind for so long. She lowered her head. The man crossed his arms, confident, as if he had complete control of the situation. Her silence was the confirmation I needed. I no longer had any doubts. Something was happening, and it didn't start today. I was just too stupid to realize it before. The hall was filled with uncomfortable looks. People whispered, averted their eyes, but it was impossible to ignore. My heart hammered against my chest, adrenaline turned my fury into a desperate need to act. My marriage, the life I believed I had, was all being torn apart right there, in front of everyone. I took my cell phone out of my pocket and opened the screen. My hands were shaking, but I needed proof. I needed to know how far this betrayal went. How many messages did you exchange with him? I asked, holding the screen in front of her. How many times have you gone out together? How long have you been deceiving me? My voice was deep, the roar of someone who was falling apart but still struggling to stay upright. She blinked rapidly, her eyes watering. I didn't want it to be like this, didn't you want it to be like this? I repeated, my voice rising again. So how did you want it? How did you intend to tell me? Or were you never going to tell me? My head was spinning. Each answer was worse than the last. The man laughed, low, ironic. I think you already understand everything. My vision turned red. The urge to attack him was unbearable. But then, a detail hit me like a knife in the chest. It wasn't just about me and my wife. There were more people involved. People I never imagined would be part of this hell. The revelation that would come next would change everything. But what really destroyed me was realizing that this betrayal wasn't just any case. It was a plan. A carefully devised plan. And what was to come was far worse than I could bear. Welcome to the channel where the truth about cheating is exposed bluntly. Here, we do not and will never support any type of infidelity. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the pain, disappointment and consequences are absolutely real. Our purpose is clear, to show how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships and leaves marks that will never be erased. Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a reality check. Now, take a deep breath and prepare for an intense and surprising narrative. The room was lit with soft lights, creating a cozy and sophisticated atmosphere. The company dinner was an event awaited by everyone, a night where employees put aside the pressures of everyday life to toast to collective success. Among the elegantly arranged tables, Thomas and Emily were an eye-catching couple. He, a man with a firm posture and an observant gaze, conveyed security and confidence. She, with her delicate gestures and engaging smile, seemed like the perfect woman, the ideal wife, the one everyone admired for her friendliness and elegance. Together, they were seen as an exemplary couple, one of those who inspired others, who aroused admired comments and even some envy. Thomas was always a man of principle, someone who took his commitment seriously and did everything he could to maintain stability in his life. His marriage to Emily was one of the pillars of his existence. From the day he met her, he was filled with a feeling of completeness, as if he had finally found someone with whom he could build a solid future. He clearly remembered the time they fell in love, the meetings that lasted into the early hours of the morning, the promises whispered in his ear, the vows of eternal love that seemed as unshakable as time. Emily, in turn, had always been a charming woman, endowed with a striking presence and charisma that made everyone around her feel special. She worked at the same company as Thomas and, although she maintained a professional attitude, her extroverted nature made her loved by everyone. Her marriage to Thomas was stable, built on years of coexistence, challenges overcome and moments of complicity. The life they had seemed perfect, but perfection was an illusion that was based on appearances. That night, Emily looked stunning. The black dress highlighted her curves, and the sweet perfume she wore filled the space around her. Thomas, sitting next to her, watched her with a mixture of admiration and pride. I liked seeing her happy, I liked the way she moved naturally, as if she owned the environment. Their marriage was no longer as passionate as it had been in the early years, but that was something natural, something that happened to all couples who built a life together. He didn't see this as a problem, just a phase, something that could be rescued with more dedication and time. Dinner went smoothly, conversations flowed, toasts were made, and laughter filled the room. Thomas was engaged in a business discussion with one of the company's directors, while Emily chatted animatedly with a colleague next door. The environment seemed perfect, but small details escaped Thomas's notice. The way Emily used her cell phone more often than usual, the furtive glances she took at the restaurant's entrance, the subtle restlessness that seemed to take over her body whenever a new guest arrived. The years of marriage taught Thomas to decipher his wife's gestures. He knew when she was happy, when she was worried, when something was bothering her. But that night, I couldn't define exactly what I saw in her expression. There was something there, something that escaped his understanding, something he couldn't name. Still, he chose to ignore it. Maybe it was just tiredness, maybe she was worried about something at work. Thomas didn't want to be paranoid, He didn't want to be suspicious for no reason. Emily, on the other hand, felt her heart racing. With each passing minute, his anxiety increased. The room was full, but his mind was elsewhere. With every glance he took at the door, he felt a mixture of expectation and fear. His fingers brushed the wine glass in his hands, and the red liquid trembled slightly, betraying his restlessness. She took a deep breath, trying to focus on the conversations around her, trying to push away the whirlwind of thoughts that consumed her. Thomas, noticing his wife's distraction, gently touched her hand. The contact made Emily startle slightly, but she soon regained her smile. He squeezed your hand affectionately, seeking your attention. "Everything is fine?" he asked, in a low tone, so only she could hear. Emily blinked rapidly, as if trying to rid herself of nagging thoughts, and smiled. "Of course, honey, I'm just a little tired." He accepted the answer, even though a trace of doubt remained inside him. Dinner continued, dishes were served, glasses were emptied and filled again. Time passed slowly for Thomas, who, from time to time, looked at Emily with a strange feeling. It was as if he was seeing something he had never seen before, a restlessness in her that bothered him in a subtle but insistent way. He tried to push those thoughts away. He trusted his wife, he trusted the relationship they built. There was no reason to suspect anything. The clock was already ticking late when a new guest arrived. The man entered with sure steps, his gaze sweeping the room as if searching for someone. Thomas, distracted by a conversation, didn't notice her arrival immediately. Emily, however, saw it. And his heart stopped for a second. The stranger walked through the hall without hesitation, his destination clear. Emily felt her breath hitch when she saw him approaching. The man stopped next to the table where she and Thomas were sitting. With a calm, deliberate movement, he took something out of his pocket and, without saying a word, placed a ring in Emily's palm. For a moment, everything was silent. Emily looked at the object in her hand as if it were a sentence. His heart raced, and his eyes slowly lifted to look at the man in front of him. Thomas, by his side, only then realized what was happening. When his eyes took in the scene, a shock ran through his body. His chest tightened, and a lump formed in his throat. The look Emily gave the man was quick, filled with a mix of surprise and nervousness. Time seemed to slow down, each detail gaining cruel clarity. The ring glittered in the soft light of the restaurant, a symbol of something that Thomas didn't yet understand, but that his heart already knew. He felt his blood run cold, he felt the reality around him deform. What was happening? Who was that man? And, most importantly, why was Emily holding a ring that wasn't his? Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came out. Everything seemed out of place, out of his understanding. His mind was trying to find answers, but nothing made sense. The weight of that moment was crushing, and he knew, deep in his soul, that something was about to change forever. The silence that followed the handover of the ring was suffocating. Thomas felt his chest burning, as if something inside him was about to explode. His gaze was fixed on Emily, waiting for her to say something, anything that made sense, that justified this absurd scene. But she remained still, her hand closed over the small ring, as if holding it would keep the truth from escaping. The man beside her remained impassive, his eyes fixed on Thomas, gauging his reaction with a disturbing calmness. The seconds dragged by like hours, each one more unbearable than the last. Emily licked her lips, took a deep breath, and finally forced a weak smile. He said it was just a joke, an unimportant gesture, something that shouldn't be taken seriously. But his voice broke. Small cracks began to form in the facade of perfection she had always displayed. Thomas sensed it, felt the tremor in her voice, the hesitation in each word. Nothing rang true. He knew Emily well enough to know when she was hiding something. And now, everything about her screamed a lie. He turned to the stranger, hoping that he at least had an explanation, something concrete that would fill the holes that were forming in his mind. But the man just smiled sideways, crossed his arms and said that Emily knew exactly what that ring meant. A biting chill ran down Thomas's spine. His gaze returned to her, desperately searching for an answer that didn't come. The discomfort on her face was enough for him to realize the truth he had been trying so hard to avoid. The company dinner continued around them, but to Thomas, everything had become a meaningless blur. The buzz of conversations, the clink of cutlery against plates, the occasional laugh, nothing was part of his reality anymore. He felt his skin tingle, his stomach churn, the weight of what was to come becoming more and more unbearable. The answers were there, in front of him, but the fear of hearing them prevented him from taking the next step. Emily finally broke the silence. He asked them to talk elsewhere, as this was neither the time nor the place to argue. But Thomas didn't want to wait. He wanted the truth there, now, in front of everyone, so there would be no escape. His heart was pounding, his hands were clenched into fists. He asked how long this had been happening, since when he had become a supporting player in his own life. Emily tried to calm him down, but every attempt she made felt like an insult, like an attempt to minimize the inevitable. The stranger remained calm, even amused, as if he had seen this scene before. It made Thomas feel a new rage, a latent hatred he had never experienced. He felt like a fool, a man who never suspected anything, who blindly trusted the woman at his side. He remembered the moments they had shared, the nights they spent together, the times he was proud to have her by his side. But now, it all seemed like a big joke, a cruel illusion that had been sustained too long. Emily finally asked them to get out of there. The tension was unbearable, and she knew she could no longer escape. Thomas followed, his legs heavy, as if each step was a superhuman effort. The stranger sat, watching them leave, without any sign of regret or guilt. Once outside, Thomas demanded answers. Emily avoided his gaze, as if staring at him was worse than confessing. She hesitated, but then, with a heavy sigh, finally admitted. She had cheated. It wasn't a slip-up, it wasn't a one-time mistake, it wasn't a moment of weakness. It was something continuous, something she maintained over time, something he never even suspected. The impact of those words hit Thomas like a punch. His body became rigid, his thoughts became confused, his vision seemed to darken for an instant. He wanted not to believe it, he wanted to deny it, he wanted to find a justification that would make everything less painful. But there wasn't. The truth was there, naked and raw, tearing through his flesh like a sharp blade. Emily tried to explain herself, but nothing she said made any difference. Thomas didn't want to hear about late regrets, about empty apologies. He wanted to understand how, when, why. But deep down, I knew none of that mattered. The betrayal had already happened. The damage was done. The night, which began as a simple get-together, ended with Thomas's world collapsing around him. He looked at Emily one last time, trying to see in her the woman he once loved. But all he saw now was a stranger. A woman who chose to deceive him, who held his hand while she lied, who shared his bed while keeping secrets. And he knew that this was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. Thomas felt the ground beneath his feet crumble little by little. Emily's betrayal was already an open, throbbing wound, but there was something beyond that, something that was still unclear. The way she hesitated, the way she looked away, the way her breath caught in her throat before completing a sentence. He knew that behavior. It wasn't just regret. It was fear. She was hiding something bigger, something that hadn't yet been said. And he knew he would only stop when he got the truth out completely. Anger burned inside him, but it was coldness that took over his gestures. There was no screaming now. There was no commotion. Just a dense, piercing silence, filled with tension. Emily looked at him with her eyes shining with anxiety, as if searching for words that would save her from what was to come. Thomas didn't intend to give her that luxury. He took her home. The journey was made without exchanging words, without explanations. The only sound was the car's engine and the thought pounding in Thomas's head. He was about to discover something that would change everything once again, as if the betrayal hadn't already been enough to devastate him. When they arrived, Emily hesitated before entering. She looked like a prisoner about to receive her sentence. He noticed this and his patience ran out. He opened the door and ordered her to enter. The silence in the house was suffocating. It was the same place where he believed he had lived happy moments, where he built memories that now seemed unreal. He felt disgusted by those walls, by the false sense of security they had given him for so long. Emily took a few tentative steps before turning to him. His expression was a mix of guilt and despair. Thomas crossed his arms, waiting for her to speak. Hoping she would at least have the decency to confess everything. But she remained silent. Thomas's patience disappeared. He demanded the truth, the complete truth. Not just about the betrayal, but about what she was still hiding. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as if she needed to gather the courage for what she was about to say. And then, finally, she revealed it. Her eyes were full of tears when she said that the betrayal was not just a passing fling. It wasn't just a slip-up. What Thomas didn't know was that there was someone else involved in this. Not just the lover, but someone else, someone who should never have been part of this story. The truth was told bluntly, without mincing words. Thomas felt the impact as if he had been hit in the chest. His knees became weak, his breathing became unsteady. Emily confessed that the person who knew everything before him, who helped cover up the betrayal, who encouraged every step, was someone Thomas would never suspect. It was his own daughter. The betrayal was not just between husband and wife. It was a well-devised scheme. It was a secret kept within his own home. His daughter knew. She was there the whole time, aware, helping her mother keep up appearances, making sure Thomas never found out. He blinked several times, as if his mind was trying to process the impossible. His own blood, his daughter, the one he raised, protected, loved unconditionally, was against him this entire time. Emily tried to justify it, saying that her daughter just wanted to see her happy, that she didn't want to hurt Thomas, that everything was done so that she could have a moment for herself, something she believed she needed. But none of that made sense to him. The betrayal was already unbearable, but his own daughter's complicity was a blow he never imagined he would receive. Thomas's stomach turned. He tried to find words, but none seemed enough to express what he felt. His mind spun, going back to past moments, little memories that now made sense. The conversations between Emily and her daughter that stopped when he entered the room. The way his daughter treated him lately, always distant, always cold, as if she no longer saw him in the same way. Thomas stumbled back and leaned against the table. He felt weak, devastated, exhausted. Emily cried, tried to hold his hand, but he pushed her away. There was nothing more to be said. There was no longer any explanation that could alleviate what had been done. He looked at Emily one last time and noticed something he never expected to see. It wasn't just guilt in her eyes. It was fear. Scared of what he would do next. Thomas straightened up. His voice was low, but carried with a weight that seemed to drag the very air around him. He said he couldn't look at her anymore, that he couldn't look at his daughter anymore. That they had destroyed something that could never be rebuilt. And then, he left. The door closed behind him, leaving Emily in tears. But Thomas didn't look back. He knew that, at that moment, his life would never be the same. And the worst of all was that that pain had not yet come to an end. Thomas walked through the night aimlessly, his steps heavy, his mind boiling in a storm that found no respite. The early morning chill cut into his skin, but he barely felt it. It was as if he were anesthetized, lost in a labyrinth of thoughts that intertwined and fell apart without logic. Everything he knew, everything he loved, had been reduced to ashes before him. His wife had cheated on him. His daughter knew. His family was a sham. And him? He was the only one who didn't know anything. The only one who lived a lie while everyone around him shared the truth in the shadows. The wind whistled through the deserted streets, and Thomas continued walking, not realizing where he was going. Until he realized that his feet had taken him to the house of a longtime friend, someone he knew he could trust. He hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. When it opened, his friend's surprised face quickly turned to concern when he saw Thomas's expression. Without saying a word, he was invited in. She sat on the couch but couldn't relax. His body was stiff, as if his own skin was too tight. His friend offered him a glass of whiskey, which he accepted without hesitation. The liquid burned his throat, but it wasn't enough to dispel the pain spreading inside him. Then, finally, he began to speak. The words came out heavy, filled with anger, disbelief and a sadness so deep that it seemed bottomless. As he narrated the night's events, he felt his friend's expression gradually change. First, surprise. Then, disbelief. And finally, something that seemed like a mix of empathy and contained fury. When he finished speaking, silence fell between the two. The friend held the glass between his hands, swirling the liquid inside it before letting out a long sigh. He said there were no words that could alleviate what Thomas was feeling. That no explanation or justification would make the betrayal any less painful. But he needed to think about what he would do next. Thomas laughed, a dry, bitter laugh. Think? He couldn't think of anything other than disgust, anger, humiliation. How could he just move on? His wife had been unfaithful, but his daughter's betrayal was what broke him most. How could someone he loved so much, who he protected and cared for, do this to him? The friend suggested he face both. That demanded answers. But Thomas didn't want to hear any more excuses. He had heard enough. I no longer wanted to look into Emily's eyes and see nothing but lies. He didn't want to see his daughter and feel the pain of knowing that she chose another side, that she deceived him without an ounce of remorse. Thomas's phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. He knew it was Emily, or maybe his daughter, trying to convince him to come home, trying to find some way to minimize the damage. But nothing could change what was already done. A few more drinks later, the friend offered the guest room for him to spend the night. Thomas accepted, without the strength to argue. But when she lay down on the strange bed, she realized that she couldn't sleep. His mind spun endlessly, replaying every detail, every moment that now made sense from a new, cruel perspective. Emily's words echoed in her head. The ridiculous justification that her daughter just wanted to see her happy. The way she tried to make it seem like he was an obstacle, that he was a problem to be worked around, that her happiness was secondary. There was nothing more to say. The sun hadn't even risen yet when Thomas made a decision. He could no longer remain there, waiting for the anger to slowly consume him. He took his keys and left without saying goodbye. He drove without a specific destination, just feeling the road passing under his tires as he tried to organize his thoughts. But it all brought him back to the same point: he couldn't stay in that marriage. I couldn't stay in that house. And maybe I couldn't continue in that life anymore. Dawn painted the sky in orange tones when he finally parked the car. He was in front of his parents' house, a refuge from his childhood that he didn't visit very often. He entered without knocking, knowing that his mother always woke up early. She was in the kitchen, preparing coffee, and froze when she saw him enter with that devastated look on his face. She didn't ask anything. He just pulled him into a tight hug, and at that moment, Thomas finally felt the tears come down. Tears he held back all night, tears he refused to shed in front of Emily or his daughter. His mother held him tight, saying nothing, allowing him to collapse into her arms as if he were a child again. After a few minutes, he managed to pull away. She sat him down and poured him a cup of coffee, patiently waiting for him to speak. Thomas took a deep breath and told everything. This time, the words came out slower, heavier, as if each one of them took away a piece of themselves as they were said. His mother listened silently, without interrupting him. Just when he was done, she held his hand and said something he needed to hear. She said he was not alone. That he wasn't to blame. That no matter how much it hurt, he needed to move on, find a new purpose, a new reason to continue. He remained there for hours, listening to advice, letting his mother's voice calm the chaos inside him a little. And then, when the day had completely settled in, he made the final decision. He would come home, but not to argue, not to try to resolve something that couldn't be resolved. He would come back to get his things. I would come back to end it once and for all. When he arrived, the house looked different. Maybe because now he saw her for what she really was, a stage for lies. He entered without knocking, found Emily in the living room, pale when she saw him there. His daughter came down the stairs at the same moment, her eyes full of uncertainty. He didn't scream. He didn't show anger. He just announced that he was leaving. Emily begged him, saying they could get through it, that he shouldn't make a hasty decision. But there was nothing more to be said. He picked up his bags, ignoring the requests, the cries. His daughter tried to grab his arm, but he pulled away. He looked at her, at Emily, and said the only thing he needed to say before leaving. He said that the two had made their choice. Now, he was doing his own thing. And then, without looking back, he left. Thomas drove aimlessly for a long time, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The world around him seemed to have lost its colors, as if he were trapped in a distorted reality, where everything he knew and believed in no longer existed. Emily's betrayal was a hard blow to bear, but what really destroyed every part of her soul was knowing that her own daughter participated in the scheme, helped hide everything, was complicit in every detail. He couldn't decide what hurt more, the infidelity of the woman who promised to love him or the disloyalty of the daughter he raised and protected his entire life. The sky was gray when he finally stopped the car at a random gas station. His mind was tired, but the physical tiredness was nowhere near the weight he carried inside his chest. He got out of the car, took a deep breath and went into the convenience store, getting a coffee. The heat of the liquid didn't bring comfort, but at least it gave him the feeling of something solid, something real in the midst of chaos. He sat down on a nearby bench and looked at his phone. There were dozens of missed calls. Unread messages. Some from Emily, some from her daughter. None of them mattered. As he stared at the display, he wondered if he would ever be able to look at them without feeling the bitter taste of disappointment. If I could forgive. But then, the question that really mattered took over his mind: did he want to forgive? The betrayal was not just a slip, a thoughtless mistake. It was planned, sustained, kept alive long enough for it to become something real. His daughter didn't just know, she actively participated, helping her mother make sure he never found out. As if he were an obstacle, a burden. As if their pain were an irrelevant detail in their search for something that, according to them, was happiness. The coffee grew cold in his hands as his thoughts ate him from the inside out. The feeling of emptiness was unbearable, a feeling that nothing else had meaning. He got up, threw the glass in the trash and went back to the car. He needed to start over. But how do you start over from nothing? How do you rebuild a life that has been demolished to its foundations? As he drove, he realized he was going to an old friend's house. Someone I hadn't seen in years, but was always there in difficult times. He stopped the car in front of the house and hesitated for a few seconds before knocking on the door. When it opened, he was greeted with a look of surprise and then concern. He sat down, took the beer offered to him and, after a long silence, told everything. His friend listened without interrupting, just absorbing every detail, every bit of the pain that Thomas poured out as if he were finally spewing a poison that was eating him up inside. When he finished, the friend didn't try to offer empty words of comfort. He just said something that resonated within him, that perhaps the greatest revenge he could have was not hatred, but indifference. That idea stayed in Thomas's mind. The anger, the desire for revenge, it was all understandable. But what if, instead of spending his energy hating, he simply disappeared from their lives. If it made someone inaccessible, unreachable. He reflected on this as he spent the night on his friend's couch. For the first time in days, he was able to sleep, albeit unsteadily. The next morning, he made a decision. He picked up the phone, deleted all the messages without reading them. He unblocked his daughter's number and sent a single short message: "You made your choice. Now live with it." After that, he threw the phone on the passenger seat and drove off. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he wasn't going back to that house. I wouldn't go back to that life. He wouldn't allow betrayal to be all that was left of him. He hit the road, his heart heavy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had control over something. He had lost his family, his trust, his peace. But maybe, just maybe, he still had himself. And that, at that moment, was all he had left. Thomas drove for hours, without a defined destination, just letting the road take him away from everything that had fallen apart in his life. The radio was playing some music, but he didn't listen. His mind was still immersed in the avalanche of events of the last few days. The smell of the car's upholstery, the sound of horns in the distance, the texture of the steering wheel beneath his fingers, everything seemed distant, as if he were living in a bad dream from which he couldn't wake up. His phone rang again, an insistent sound that he ignored. I didn't need to look to know who it was. At this point, Emily's and his daughter's voices were just echoes that he refused to let into his head. There was nothing more to be said. There were no excuses that could fix what was done. The car stopped in front of a roadside motel. The sign flashed intermittently, casting red and blue light over the worn asphalt. Thomas got out of the car, grabbed a small suitcase from the trunk, and walked to the front desk. The woman behind the counter looked at him curiously, perhaps finding the hard expression on his face strange. He didn't have the energy to explain anything. He just handed over the money and took the room key. Inside the small motel room, he threw himself on the bed, closing his eyes tightly, trying to block out his thoughts. The yellowish ceiling seemed to rotate above him. The silence was heavy, loaded with memories he tried to avoid. But his mind wouldn't leave him alone. It was then that his phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. A female voice came on the other end of the line, hesitant but familiar. It was his daughter. She began with an apology. Her voice was shaky, full of emotion, but Thomas didn't respond. He waited. I wanted to see how far it would go. She continued, saying that she never wanted to hurt him, that she never imagined things would get to this point. That he did what he did because he believed he was protecting his mother, that if he kept everything under control, no one would get hurt. But now he saw the damage he had caused. Now he knew he had been wrong. Thomas laughed, a short, humorless laugh. He asked her if she really thought the problem was just what happened at the end. If she really thought hiding everything from him was an act of protection. He asked her at what point she looked at him and decided that her happiness was less important than her mother's convenience. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then finally her daughter whispered that she was scared. Afraid of that, he asked. And then, in an almost imperceptible voice, she said that she was afraid he would never forgive her again. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. Forgive? He knew that one day, perhaps, time would lessen the pain, but at that moment, everything was still too raw, too real. He couldn't just forget everything. He couldn't pretend that his confidence hadn't been destroyed. He took a deep breath and told her he didn't have an answer. That he didn't know what would happen. That now, he needed to stay away. She cried, asked him to come back, said she missed him. But he remained firm. He said he needed time. When he hung up, he felt something different. Not relief, but certainty. He wouldn't go back to that life. He needed to move on. He got up, picked up his suitcase and went back to the car. There was a new path ahead of him. He just needed to figure out where it would take him. Thomas didn't come back. He didn't answer any more calls, he didn't answer any more messages, he didn't look back. He understood that some pains don't heal with time, they just become part of who you are. Emily's betrayal was a wound, but her daughter's complicity was the blade that kept it open, throbbing, impossible to ignore. He tried, for a while, to imagine a scenario where he could forgive them, where he could see them again without feeling the bitter taste of disappointment, but he realized that it wasn't possible. The past could not be undone, and some betrayals were beyond repair. Emily tried to move on, but nothing was the same. The weight of guilt, Thomas's absence, his silence that was more cruel than any scream, consumed everything that was left of her confidence. She lost more than her husband, she lost the image she had of herself, the certainty that she could simply carry on as if nothing had happened. The nights were long, the days were empty. She looked in the mirror and saw someone she didn't recognize, someone who destroyed everything for something that, in the end, wasn't worth it. The lover. It disappeared. Without the secret game, without the risk, without the adrenaline, the spell was broken, and it didn't take long for him to leave her alone with the consequences of her choices. She tried to start over, but starting over without genuine repentance was impossible. And even though he tried to convince himself that he could still be happy, deep down, he knew that he had thrown away the only thing that really mattered. The daughter tried to get closer. At first, I called every day, then once a week, then once a month. Thomas never answered. He never blocked her number, but he never responded. For him, silence was the most honest answer he could give. He didn't hate her, he didn't want revenge, he just knew he couldn't trust her anymore. The love he felt for her still existed, but now it was a distant love, something he kept buried in a place where it couldn't hurt him again. She understood. And one day, he stopped trying. Not because he stopped loving his father, but because he realized that some things never go back to the way they were before. Her mistake was not just being there for her mother, but believing that her father's pain was a minor detail in a story that was not hers to control. Life went on for her, but with a void that was never filled. Thomas found something he didn't expect, freedom. He always believed that his life was structured, that his happiness came from the stability of a home, a family. But when he found himself alone, he realized that it wasn't loneliness that destroyed him, but the idea that everything he built had been a lie. Now, he had the chance to build something new. He traveled, saw new places, met people who knew nothing about his past, who didn't look at him with pity or judgment. He realized that there was still life beyond the pain, that he could still laugh without feeling guilty, that he could still look forward without the weight of what was left behind. He allowed himself to love again. It was a slow, unhurried, but real process. And when he finally gave in to this new love, he knew he was ready to truly move on. Everyone paid the price for their choices. Emily was alone, not because she couldn't find someone, but because no one who came into her life could fill the void left by everything she lost. Her daughter followed a different path, trying to learn from her mistakes, trying not to repeat the patterns her mother followed. Thomas. He started over, not like before, but in a way he never imagined possible. He didn't forget, he didn't erase the past, but he found a way to make it no longer define who he was. Now I want to hear from you, what did you think of this story? What would you do in the protagonist's place? Comment your opinion below, I want to know what you think about this betrayal and each character's choices. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, because here we show the truth about betrayal and its consequences. And remember, this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Until the next story.